Excellent. All right, so before we jump into the meat of today's conversation, we're going to cover that we are governed by the Linux Foundation antitrust rules. You can find those in the meeting notes. There's a link. It's on the Linux Foundation website and is important for everybody to be aware of. Additionally, we have a Cardea Code of Conduct, which you can also find a link to on the meeting notes, but I will summarize. It's be nice. Everybody's welcome here, including that they're welcome and encouraged to have a voice in this discussion. And if you ever have any issues, you can reach out to either Ken or myself. And then our last agenda item before we jump into our discussion on schemas is whether anybody would like to introduce themselves today. It can be new people or returning people. We'd love to have you say hi.
I realize that a few of you may not recognize the Russian writing on there. The first person with Russian writing is Asiya. She's the president of Network Synergy, a proud Indicio node, and hopefully helper in the Cardea project. The second person is Leila Ishbaeva. Leila is the president of the largest private healthcare system in Kazakhstan, which has got about 500,000 patients. So roughly speaking, about 3% of the country's population.
Wow. Well, welcome. Nice to know who's behind those Russian names or Kazakhstan names. Anybody else?
I'm Kim Ebert. I'm with Indicio. I'm a senior software engineer.
Welcome, Kim. And Kim's going to be filling in for Mike today, so he's going to do his best Mike impressions. All right. Last call. Anybody else want to introduce themselves? Okay, well, with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. So this meeting is a continuation from last week's meeting. Last week, we had a deep dive into the vaccination schema. Our goal in reviewing the schemas in depth are a couple of points. The first is to make sure that we lock in some loose plan so that we can start to build the governance, which is dependent on the schema. And so that's really important that we sort of set level set on what's going to be in the schema. The other goal for reviewing the schemas in depth is to make sure that we're going to be cross-compatible across all of the other big projects that are going on. And so we're considering the Good Health Pass and the EU project and making sure that those are all going to be cross-compliant. And I think that the third point is that we want to make sure that these schemas have a life beyond COVID. And so designing them to be sort of clinically neutral. And so that's also very important to us as we review these schemas. So as we jump into this, I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. There are a couple of things. We spent the entire meeting last week talking about the vaccination schema. There's a couple of points we want to bring up to close that out. And then today's discussion is mostly going to be about the exemption schema. And hopefully this is going to be a discussion. So please feel free to pipe in, interject, voice your opinion as it comes up. So for those that may not have been with us last week, this schema layout is the field name. We've put a category just for organizations effort. We also have a value type to define what should be populated or what kind of data should go in there. And one of the things that we added were these ISO code sets so that we can not just have text, but actually define what should really be populated in those. And that's specifically tied to location. So we have state, province, region, and country codes. And then we have a brief description. I had historically added some information about prevalence in US healthcare data, just for sort of educational purposes. And then we have some comments from our discussion and review that we've been taking as we've gone through this together. So last we spoke, we reviewed a lot. Yeah, go ahead.
Is that spreadsheet on the repo or shared in any way, or will be it shared in any way?
It is not yet, but it will be. I believe that we hinted at that last week, that this would be, once it gets locked in, we'll sort of publish this as the final spec. I don't know if you have any other comments or thoughts on that.
No, that's all I wanted to make sure, is that we're planning to, or we've already made this publicly available.
Yes, it's absolutely will plan to. And I'm happy to share it in draft if anybody wanted that. So last we spoke, we went through here. You'll notice we've neutralized some of the naming conventions so that they will hopefully be cross-country compatible. Similarly, gender legal is an important one because that can be ambiguous in some cases. And we have some additional logic around what I want to call out is this concept of a code qualifier, and the code name. So name would be the text description. In this case, for the manufacturer, the qualifier might be the code system name. So that's, for example, MVX. And then the code is actually the numbers or alphanumeric char. So that's, for example, 208 is, I think, Pfizer. So that combination is really important so that the governance can key off of codes and code systems, which will be more reliable than names, which might also have some local layers to make them presentable and readable to in the language of the users. What I wanted to follow on from last week are two areas. The first is to highlight we did not add provider to this vaccination credential. Again, this vaccination credential is ideally going to be neutral to the type of vaccine that's being administered. I know in US data that the providers are most of the time available. And so I'm not sure if anybody thought this was important. I wanted to bring it up, or we could cut it from this because this is already quite a large spec. Are there any thoughts on including the actual provider who did the administration beyond their organization into our schema?
What useful purpose does it serve in medical records, for instance?
I think there's a couple of scenarios that could happen here. One would be that you identify something malicious going on. Maybe this provider was saying that they vaccinated people when they weren't really vaccinating those people, right? So that the record existed. Or that there was an issue with the way that they administered the vaccine or the protocols that they were following, right? You might find something that then would cause a revocation of this data, and this would help to narrow that down. I don't think clinically, if you trust that the vaccine really was administered and that this record is accurate, which presumably it would be, I'm not sure that it has relevance beyond that. That's my opinion. So if there's others, please chime in.
Would it open up the opportunity, like you say, to these vaccine, the cards, because really what we're trying to do is provide a verifiable credential on the actual, say, like it was administered. I mean, does that? I think it does say just what you said, the fraud of getting these cards that are now out on the dark web that can be manipulated. They can put whoever they want on the cards now. So I don't know. I'm open for discussion around it.
Yeah, so keep in mind, for example, on the US card, I don't have mine in my office with me, but the US card does not have provider on it, right? It just has the patient and the dates and where it was administered and which vaccine. It's really in the medical record, right? When you start to think about issuing these out of healthcare systems, that data would then become available because there's an administering, right, the administration provider for that vaccination. And I think that if I sort of focus us in on the question here, it's, do we think that having the provider will add value in any possible scenario to this schema, or should, or not, I think is the question.
So, I
Or-
mean, does this add value to the user or
governance?
the governance? So an example case would be, is it helpful for me personally to know who I received a vaccination from, or does it add value to the governance?
Do we already have that in lines 15, 16, 17?
In lines 15, is that what you said?
Yeah,
This is the, so this is the facility. This is the, the healthcare agency or organization that I went to, but not the actual human person that injected me. And the question is really, do we need to get to the granularity of the provider, or do we think that by saying, oh, you got it at, healthcare facility A, that's plenty?
so think outside of COVID, does it provide, for any of these other, let's say smallpox or, yellow fever in a global environment, does it bring value?
Yeah.
So I guess a clarification, Q, if you could, provider, this is talking about the actual person who performed and administrated that, not the actual location or organization that did that, correct?
That is correct. This is the human behind, holding the syringe.
Got it.
I think I added this because I know it's in the data. It doesn't mean it's really reliably in the data. And I wanted us to discuss it so that we could get everybody's opinion. You guys are being rather quiet on this. I wonder whether it matters on the global scale, because I'm not going to know who that doctor is in Kazakhstan, right? It's going to be, to me, meaningless. I think the scenario that I can see it being valuable for is in the management of the credential. If it needs to be, if something were to go wrong, being able to isolate the data a little bit further. But I'm not sure that that's a good value proposition to adding it to the schema. So I defer to other opinions on that.
I mean, the only other comment I would make is that ultimately it's up to the jurisdiction, right, that is issuing what is the valid set of data elements, right, for that clinical event. So I think if you look at, or looking at least, if you look at the COVID example, perhaps you could look at yellow fever and some other vaccination and immunization examples to see if it's required in different jurisdictions.
And I think you're exactly right. I think, in the travel that I've experienced over the course of the last 15 years or more, 20 years, has only required the yellow shot record.
Booklet?
Yeah, booklet. I've got 5 of them, but it's hard to maintain them all in one place. That's the challenge. So you just have to show it. And a lot of them are, you go to those countries, you go in, if you don't have your shot record, they'll either give you a shot record, or you pay them $30 or $40 in cash and they give you the shot record without the shot. So I've seen that in many countries.
Right. And in those scenarios, does the provider, individual person matter?
No.
Okay. So I wanted to put it here for discussion. I'm leaning toward that fact that we should remove it. Last week we did not have it and we were pretty happy with our schema. So I threw this wrench in.
Can I offer one more thought?
Absolutely.
So in the near future, I see a use case where the administrator of the vaccine is going to be the one signing the credential as it's offered to the holder right then and there. So from that perspective, it's important to have some kind of provenance of who is the issuer, who is the actual person clicking the button. So from that perspective, I think it would make sense to keep it. But what is the risk of having a really, really long schema? So that we would kind of cut down on the number of attributes, because it sounds like as much information as possible seems like a good idea, unless there is a risk of having a very long schema and somehow having an adverse reaction to that schema.
I think Ken might have an opinion on schema length.
Schema length just slows down computation and increases the size, makes it a little bit more difficult to transmit. The real question is not schema length. I think it's whether or not it provides any useful information. And if it doesn't provide any useful information, why carry it around? If it does provide useful information, we should not omit it. Vadim, do you have an opinion on the thing you brought up was who is issuing the credential, and typically the organization is the one actually issuing the credential, not the provider themselves. So I don't know if that I'm not sure how much that plays into the equation.
I think it would be just to add to that, it would be the organization or their electronic record system, but not necessarily that individual. They're
I guess
engaged.
Internally, there will be some kind of metadata as to who initiated the issuance of that credential as a result. So maybe in that case, if there's a record internally that could be queried by some outside agency, then maybe this information doesn't have to be part of the credential itself.
So in the sake of being a complete record for the individual and being informative to the individual, I recommend that we keep this in because it does provide additional data to the end user.
I don't know that there's a strong argument to kick it out, besides the fact that it's not always populated. So, but
Okay.
I think we could leave it in without too much trouble. If it turns out that no one ever uses it, we could update a new version of the schema that omits it.
Okay, excellent. Moving on, because we're not
Sorry,
spending our whole. Yeah,
sorry,
go ahead.
one more thought. So what implication does this have on privacy of the person administering the vaccine if their full name is actually part of this credential? Just my last thought.
They have no privacy. That's part of the challenge of being a healthcare provider, is that your name will be recorded with multiple procedures, and that's a fact of life for the healthcare providers, I'm afraid.
I'm sorry to throw this in, but we've just had about an 8-minute sidebar on this with Leila, who's actually the administrator of a very large network, and her comment was that on the one hand, it's information that's collected in Kazakhstan for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that if an individual doctor is not doing all his or her vaccinations correctly, then they can go back and find the person who actually, all those vaccinations, those people can be found and maybe revaccinated. The second thing is, what happens in a situation where if we do decide to keep it in, a person has, for example, their Pfizer vaccine from one person, and then, 8 weeks later, for whatever reason, gets it from the second one from a different person. Are we going to have both fields, one field, the last field? How does that work?
So each vaccination is its own credential record. So that they would have a whole separate schema for the second shot, and that would be unique data for each one.
Okay, so our vote, well, anyway, in Kazakhstan, we actually collect the information, and whether, if you find it's valuable or not, we do collect it, so.
And you raised the same use case that I was saying, which is something goes wrong with how that provider is doing it, then you know exactly who that, which credentials were affected by that provider.
Correct.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Jeff and Layla. All right, so the last point of discussion on, hopefully, on the vaccine schema is last week we had a little bit of a discussion about should the data be in the metadata or in the actual schema itself, specifically some points around the issuer and the date. And I went back and double checked the eHealth specification, which was, I think, Vadim, I think you were the one who had raised this. And the EU spec actually says it's in the metadata specifically. So I have put those in gray to highlight that they're in the metadata. However, we did put the issuer name in the content of the credential. So I wanted to make sure that this is sort of a happy medium and whether there's any comments on this approach.
I guess the question with that is, could that not be derived from the DID of the issuer?
Yes, so that was an interesting point. So in the metadata, it's a DID, which is the credential issuer. So it's an unintelligible to the human eye data point. And so that was what we thought might be helpful to have in the credential is a sort of human readable value of who issued it. And then the DID would be in the metadata if you wanted to do more with that.
I know two approaches with that, and the first one is the one that I would propose first is that so far we've been defining issuers within the governance framework, and you would be able to correlate the DID to that governance framework to get that name, a human readable name, and or additional information about that issuer. Longer term, you could have the holder be presented proof of the issuer's status. So be able to get verifiable human readable names and contact details. And that could be used and correlated with the associated DID, the metadata. So those are two possibilities for being able to associate it. That doesn't, those are both technical ways of doing that. It still may be wise to include it as part of the schema, but I bring those up as options to reduce a field that we may not necessarily need.
Okay, are there other thoughts on this?
The one disadvantage of putting it only in the governance is that if you don't have access to the governance file, you can't tell in a human readable form who that issuer is. So that's one of the arguments for putting it in as a field within the credential itself.
I think that's one of the benefits of the governance framework file, because I think that's a valid point, but I think one of the thoughts there is that you should be able to have the governance framework file on hand and cached versus having to go to an external location to get that.
True. However, let's say we have a government has provided a governance file, but the issuer in this case is not one of the people who is listed. So it's difficult for a particular holder who doesn't have the governance file for that area to ascertain which issuer this was.
Yeah, or the Wi-Fi goes down in the airport.
If it's cached, you're covered there. But I do think that the redundancy of the information in the governance and in the credential is not particularly harmful. It does consume more space, and it is partly redundant with the DID that's in the metadata. But are there other arguments for or against including that name of the issuer as an attribute?
Underdeveloped apps might not have the ability to read and understand the governance. And so being able to have the plain text version is helpful.
Thanks, Kim.
I do have a question of which one would take precedence between the governance framework file and the credential itself here. So if, for instance, you have a name change of a issuer, which takes precedence in terms of what's displayed to the user and used.
I believe the did is what would be in the governance, but it does raise an interesting question, which is what if there's a discrepancy between the human readable name and the did name on file? Right, that's the point you were raising?
Correct.
I don't think it particularly matters. I mean, companies change names all the time, and so it would just be considered part of the historical reference to it. And so displaying either name would be appropriate in that use case.
I think given the arguments here, I'm in favor of keeping the field then for redundancy sakes.
Excellent. And these 4 are in the metadata. These are not, by the way, these were not the official metadata tag names. These were my sort of human readable version of those tag names.
When we get to publishing this, we'll get it updated with the official names.
Yes. Okay. Any issues with having these tags only in the metadata, or everybody's comfortable with that being where they are? Okay. I'm going to ask if there's any other thoughts or opinions on the vaccination schema, positive or negative. Otherwise, I'm going to suggest that what we've displayed and discussed here is how we'll proceed.
Yeah, I have one question. The names of the attributes themselves, written this way with the underscore for spaces, is that some kind of a standard that we're following here? There's some guidance on that?
That was my, yeah, go ahead.
It is the indie method most commonly used. There's not a rigid requirement in the indie Aries community. Some of the early parsers forced everything into this format. And so by following this format, the older agents can be interactive and interoperable without changes. So that's the reason for the method behind the madness.
Gotcha. Thank you for that.
So this is our ongoing effort to make things happen and do things. If we discover going forward that there needs to be adjustments to these schemas, then that can be brought up at a later time, and we'll have schemas 2.0 and have a new round to discuss how to evolve the schemas as we move forward.
Excellent.
Interesting question on that. Is there a possibility for a minor version update? Are there some things here that may not be, or would any change to the schema result in a major version update, do you think?
Major minor is not what I was trying to highlight. The fact that it will evolve over time is what I'm trying to work for. And I think that it would probably be minor changes. I don't foresee major changes to this because I think we've taken into consideration a lot of data sources and past experience. So I think it would probably be in minor versions as we move forward.
That makes sense to me. I was mostly asking, mine was a follow-up question, partially also from the governance framework perspective in terms of how do you indicate what schemas are supported and supporting backwards compatibility, whether that's an option or something, just as an interesting thought.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I'm going to move on to the exemption schema. Unless, Ken, do you think we need a vote, or silence was our positive vote?
It's better to call for it and see if there's either chat or discussion. People who, you can do raise of hands if you want on the, or
Or if you all are feeling shy, you can just chat vaccine schema, thumbs up, okay, and we'll move forward with the exemption schema.
Yep.
Yeah, well,
Excellent. I see a couple of thumbs up, but those are from Eberts. So if there's others that can respond, that would be great. I'm going to start talking about the exemption schema in the interest of time, but would appreciate the formal all good on vaccines. All right. So hopefully our exemption schema is going to go a little smoother just because we've talked about a lot of things already that carry over here. So again, we have field category. We've defined the population of that field. We have a brief description and some comments from our reviews. So exemption schemas cover a couple of things before we get into the bulk of this. An exemption in this case could cover somebody not getting a vaccination. And there can be different reasons why people get exemptions. Maybe they're allergic to a component of the vaccine and therefore are ineligible for it. Or they have a religious exemption, or I think the third category is philosophical. I'm not sure if there's others. We can discuss that as part of this, but this is the scenario where there's sort of allowed to not get that thing. And in this case, the first question that I have is whether or not the exemption record would have unique identifiers, a master patient index and a patient local ID, because the issuing authority for the exemption may not be a healthcare facility. And so it might be a school or a government. So that's one question. We can go through this and come back to answer them. We have the same baseline demographics carried over from the vaccine credential. So I think that those should be fine. We'll skip over that. We have an exemption issue date, the state, province, region, the country, those again using the ISOs. We have an exemption type, which I believe would be medical, philosophical, religious. Does anyone know of any other exemption reasons that we might want to identify?
The reasons that we found were in the jurisdictions that supported exemptions or required exemptions exist. Those were the types of categories that we saw in our limited subset. I think we looked at California and a couple of other jurisdictions in the United States. Are there other, internationally particularly, are there different categories of exemptions that exist? Jeff, do you know if in Kazakhstan there are exemption certificates issued?
Actually, Ken, we're just having that discussion right now, but as of right now, it seems that the exemptions are mostly to do with age. In other words, no one under 18 or over, I believe it was either 60 or 80, I wasn't absolutely sure, that has a pre-existing exemption is required to get a vaccination. But the under 18, of course, is a different reason. The medical reason seems to be the only one that's being accepted here. I don't know if, so far nobody has volunteered that the other two reasons are able to be used here in Kazakhstan. So it looks to me like those three things cover everything. Yes.
Great. Okay. If anyone learns anything as we continue, please again pipe in. The next is the, so this we had subset under exemption medical type. Is it permanent or temporary? So for example, maybe the person is pregnant and the vaccine is undecided about whether pregnant people should be getting that. That might be a temporary medical exception. And so you can distinguish between a permanent exception and a temporary exception. This does have, so I have a couple of questions. One is whether or not this should be a Boolean and the field should be exemption permanent or exemption temporary, or it would be permanent, exemption permanent, true, false kind of thing. Because the other data point skipping ahead is we have an exemption expiration date. So that's a structural question to consider, or whether it should be the text. I think the benefit of a Boolean is that it's a little bit more language agnostic than human readable text.
I'm okay moving forward with the Boolean.
Okay. So we're gonna say Medicaid exemption permanent.
I think we wanted the medical precursor on
Yes, thank you.
this, or prefix.
Okay. Any other opinions on changing this to a Boolean? All right. We then have an exemption note, which is a text field, which would be the reason. I'm not sure that this would necessarily have governance, a play in governance, but would be valuable to a human who might be trying to interpret what this is for. Okay, now we get into an interesting one, which is how to handle this exemption credential in terms of, do you have one exemption credential or do you need an exemption credential for multiple things? And the reason that this matters is maybe you're exempt from all vaccines, right? If you're not getting vaccinations for a specific reason like religion, then maybe you don't get any vaccine. Or maybe you're exempt from a specific vaccine because you're allergic to that component, a component in that vaccination. And so there's a little bit of a conundrum about how do we document this. So the first draft is that we could have an exemption from all. We could change this from true false. It's, yeah, to a, this is a Boolean also. We can, let me just make sure this is standardized. Okay. Which would indicate that this is a universal exemption, or I guess we could capture the specific disease that this is an exemption for. The challenge here is if it's multiple, then there becomes an issue with how do we concatenate those values together or delineate them so that each pairing, right, there's 3 data points affiliated with the disease, that those stick together, their relationship to each other is maintained.
So
go ahead.
Just a little bit of background here. There are some places where a blanket true false statement is a valid option. But in California, they require a separate, each exemption to be listed out. And we could solve that in one of 2 ways. Either we could issue multiple exemption certificates, one for each targeted disease, or we could combine them all into a single field. But as Kilo's pointing out, there becomes some data correlation issues when you have multiple listed out in a single field.
Thanks, Kim. Said much more eloquently than I was trying to. So that's the crux of the question. Is there, let me let the crowd speak. Any thoughts on this? Is anyone aware in your municipality about whether you can have an exemption across the board or whether you need one for each thing?
So for example, in my area, an exemption across the board is valid in Idaho. In California, it requires individuals.
And so the way that we have this drafted, this schema could work in both where Kim is in Idaho and California, because they could use the exemption from all and then potentially leave these blank because it's a blanket exemption. Or if you were sorry?
I was going to ask for the other direction. Would you leave exemption from all blank, or would that be false?
False. I think it would be false.
I tend to agree.
And then you would have one. My concern is that by listing, if you list multiple diseases, like let's say you're allergic to, I think it's like egg, and there's egg in 2 vaccines, you can't get those particular ones. My recommendation is that you have 2 exemption credentials, one for each of the vaccines that you're allergic to, because then these fields become single key value pairs rather than trying to manage the relationship of the code, system, and name for each. Because if one of those was, maybe you didn't populate the name for one of them, then the data shifts. It gets a little bit more complicated, especially in the governance management.
The other reason I recommend that approach is because in the vaccine case, you would have a separate credential for each vaccine that you would have received.
Yes, so it's a little more similar.
Can I just throw in a quick comment from our colleagues in Kazakhstan? The system for the national health system in Kazakhstan, children at 6 months get the first vaccine, at 2 years they get the second, at 4 years they get something else, and by 6 they've gotten their 4th and final vaccine prior to school. That information is carried on a single document that's registered in the National Ministry of Health database, so that if the family moves from one city to another, when they enroll the children in school, the school knows they're already enrolled. Parents do have the opportunity to reject vaccinations for simply just they don't want their kid to have them. They don't have to specify any particular reason. And then that information is also entered on the vaccine record of that child. So I don't know how this fits into that, but I just want you to know that's how vaccinations are done here in Kazakhstan, and probably very, very likely in the entire CIS region.
So that would likely be classified as a philosophical exemption, and
Sure.
Without a requirement for a reason to be listed, unless they do
Right.
require a reason to be listed in the note field.
Right.
Jeff, did you say that in Kazakhstan, and I forget which vaccine, it's like 4 or 5 shots to be fully vaccinated, and it's, as you've mentioned, age dependent, so they're spaced out?
Correct.
Did you say that when they have all of them, the government is then saying, they've been vaccinated, and it's just tracking the end result, not each individual shot?
No, everything is, they're all recorded, so the government
Individually.
knows which ones, that's right. So the government knows for the individual child, which of the 4 boxes or all of the 4 boxes have been checked.
Excellent. Great. And our vaccination schema, which is 1 shot, 1 credential, would work. That's part of the reason for doing that, because depending on their age at the time, they may be fully vaccinated, right? If they're 3, they should only have had 2 shots, and that makes them fully vaccinated.
Correct.
Great.
do have a question here. So if we do separate credentials for each exemption, which I'm in favor of, if we take COVID as an example, would you need an exemption for each provider, if you will, or because there's 3 different providers for COVID vaccines, would you need a for all 3 of them based off of like an allergy, or could you identify just the disease's code?
It's just by disease. So in that, because if you were only allergic to one, like let's say there was an issue with the mRNA vaccine and you couldn't have that one, there's still an option for you. And so the recommendation probably by your clinical staff would be to get the one you're not allergic to. If you were allergic to all of them, then you would have the disease specific exemption. You can't get any of the vaccines for this disease, COVID.
Okay, thank you.
Kim, is that what you were gonna say?
I was going to add on to that. That is why there is an expiration date on the exemption. In some localities, they require a review, even if you have a permanent exemption on a yearly basis. So for example, in California, they require the medical provider to issue another exemption after a year, indicating, hey, we've reviewed this and they are still indeed exempt from vaccinations.
Yep, excellent. So since we're moving on, let's go through that. So we do have, in this case, for medical exemptions, we did list out all the wonderful details about the person who issues the exemption. Because a doctor may just may be issuing exemptions to be nice when maybe that isn't really the case. If you wanted to verify why they couldn't or shouldn't have this thing, then you would have the information to go back to, and that it's a valid medical reason from a valid clinical person. So this is more robust than what was on the vaccination schema, which helps put a little validity and trust behind the medical exemption.
The other thing that we may need here, Keela, is the area for a parent field. And this might be used in the case when the parent is getting the exemption for a child. That there may be a requirement to record who that parent or guardian was that provided that exemption. Maybe a custodial signing type field. I guess it might be covered under guardian.
Yeah, we can, that's a great point. And certainly we can lay out some additional fields for that. You could argue, and it'd be interesting to know this answer globally, is whether the definition of an adult is the same. So could you guess this by age, or that it was like a 3-year-old isn't capable of making this decision on their own. So of course it's by their legal guardian.
Yes, but you would need to know which legal guardian potentially, because some children have multiple parents, obviously, mother and father, and so the state may require that they record which parent signed for it.
Got it. Okay, noted. I'll get those drafted. Okay, then Kim already mentioned that we have an exemption expiration date. This covers a couple of things Kim's example was that certain municipalities require that it be reviewed. And so they might say, we're issuing this credential, but it's only good for 1 year. In other cases, it might expire because it's temporary, which is why we flipped that field to a Boolean. And that would also work for that scenario as well. Okay, and then we've added, and this is similar again to vaccines, we have the exemption credential issuer, the original issuer, and the name of the person, and then we have the same information in the schema as we had on the vaccination credential. So let's see if there's any comments on this as a whole or in any specific details. Right now, this is designed for one, unless it's everything, it's going to be one exemption credential per specific disease exemption.
I'm in favor of the single per credential or single per exemption. And potentially I missed this from last week's conversation, but could you clarify on the certificate original issuer and identifier?
Yeah, those are designed to support the idea that there might be an intermediary party that's issuing the electronic version of this, right? Because your government agency, issued you a piece of paper that says you're exempt, and then you have that vetted by somebody who can turn it into an electronic credential. So these are the reference points to say whoever issues this electronic credential was not the same person who actually said, here's the exemption. Or institution, I should say, not person.
Got it. And was this present also on the vaccination schema?
It is, and that's specifically to support the concept of sort of translator from paper to the electronic version.
Yep. Awesome,
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any comments? I think one question I have is, right now we're talking about vaccines. This exemption schema actually doesn't specify that this is a vaccination exemption, because I believe some people can also be medically exempt from other things like getting tested. Can you be exempt from being COVID tested?
I haven't heard of that.
Potentially specific types of tests. I'm not the medical expert here though, so.
Yeah, I'm not either. I think maybe, Jeff, if you can see what Layla thinks. The question is this a vaccine exemption schema, or does this need to be a slightly more broad exemption schema?
We just had a sidebar on the subject of which parent or legal guardian may be making the decision. These are first world issues that do not exist in the third world. So the exclusions, the exclusion schema that we have right now is actually quite sufficient for everything in Kazakhstan. You've really our collective hats are off to you for coming up with this robust framework. It would probably be half this number of fields if left to some data developer in Kazakhstan. So this is more than plenty. So the short answer is no. We past the thing you've already defined, which is exemption from vaccination. The exemption from testing and all that are not needed.
Thanks, Jeff. Are there other thoughts on that? Has anyone other, I mean, if we think beyond COVID, right, out into the larger future, would we use this exemption schema for anything else? Otherwise, I might suggest that we call it a vaccine exemption schema, so it's clear.
I think we call it a vaccine exemption schema simply because we haven't considered other options. Later, we could make a revision to extend it to other options and use cases.
We did do a careful analysis on taking the vaccine beyond a COVID vaccine, but we did not make that same careful analysis on exemptions to take it beyond vaccination exemptions. So I think it would be prudent to narrow the scope for the time being. Any other opinions?
Okay, and we've had so much fun talking about this that we've already run out of time. So I would suggest that we proceed with this as discussed today. And if there are any agreements or disagreements to that, please let us know.
Они как контактные идут, и их передают для контроля. Это бесплатно.
We actually do have just one comment. It is possible to reject a PCR test, but then of course you can't fly, you can't do anything. So theoretically, I don't know why somebody would want a vaccination credential that says they don't want the vaccination or anything else, but that's that situation. Yes, somebody could reject it, but then they just wouldn't do it.
Got it. Okay, and next week, Ken, where I apologize for cutting this a little bit short, and we can loop back on this briefly at the beginning of next week if anybody has new thoughts that or information they've uncovered. Ken, if I'm not mistaken, next week's meeting is on machine readable governance, now that we've gotten our schemas a little bit more locked in. Is that correct?
Yeah, we're going to try to dig a little deeper on the machine readable governance, and we will have a discussion about how to handle. I think we'll have a quick review of issuers and verifiers in the governance, and then we'll have a discussion about formats for rules. And I don't know if we'll be ready to lock down on rules formats yet, but that will introduce the topic and start us down that path.
Excellent. Well, thanks for sparing an extra 2 minutes, everybody. And we'll talk next week.
Good, thank you.